Welcome to the afternoon session. And in this 1 hour lecture, we're going to talk about the GMW Multiparty protocol and OT extension. So we're going to talk about these two issues. The first is the GMW protocol named after gold like Micali and Vigdazon. It's a multi-party protocol for more than two parties. The number of rounds depends on the depth of the circuit that we're computing. But it's a very nice protocol based heavily on oblivious transfer. And we're going to describe it here. We're going to only cover the case with security against semi-honest adversaries, not malicious adversaries. And the protocol is covered in that Goldre's book. The second issue we'll cover is OT extension, oblivious transfer extension. And the reason is that oblivious transfer is used by the YAO protocol, and it used to be the main computational bottleneck of that protocol. And it's used even more in the GMW protocol. If you recall, in the YAO protocol, we used oblivious transfer for every input wire of the second party. In the GMW protocol, we're going to use oblivious transfer for every gate. Okay? So these protocols really depend on the oblivious transfer, and oblivious transfer extension is a way of making oblivious transfer much more efficient. Okay? So we'll discuss that, and that's actually very important if you want to implement secure protocols efficiently. So the GMW protocol, so it's run between n parties and could be arbitrary. Suppose the parties are called P1 up to Pn, and suppose that they have inputs x1 up to xn. We say here that they have input bits, but they could be inputs of arbitrary length. And suppose they need to get outputs y1 up to yn. Suppose that party I will get input yi, but it's not very important. We can solve any variant. Now, whatever function they want to compute, we'll first express that function as a Boolean circuit, as we discussed before. And suppose that the circuit is only is implemented using only XOR and AND gates. Okay, so the only gates we're going to use essentially implement addition and multiplication modulo 2. So with addition modulo 2, we can compute the negation. If we XOR a bit with 1, we get the negation of that bit. So if we have addition and negation, we have a complete set of gates. We can compute any function. Okay. So if we can solve the secure computation problem for these two gates, we can compute any function that we need to compute. Okay. And also, just to make things nice, suppose that the wires are ordered so that if wire k is a function of wires I and j, then k is greater than I and j. So therefore, when we start evaluating the gates, we'll start from the first gate and go all the way to the last gate. And we know that when we evaluate a certain gate, we always have the outputs ready for the values ready for the inputs that go into that gate. Now, the setting is that the adversary might control any subset of the parties. At the worst case, there might be n parties. The adversary might be controlling all but one of these parties, and he wants to learn the input of the last party or do something bad to the last party. And you participate in the computation. You have 100 other parties, and all of them collude together just to learn your input. Okay, and we'll obtain security against that that attack. We will not cover the adaptive case, meaning that before the protocol begins to run, the adversary has to decide which parties it's going to corrupt. Okay, it cannot do this interactively, adaptively during the protocol run. Adaptive security is much more complicated. Also, we'll assume that the communication is synchronous. They're like communication rounds where messages are sent from every party to every party. And we also assume that there are private channels between any pair of parties. So they can communicate without anyone being able to eavesdrop to their communication. And we can easily achieve this using encryption. To implement this, you can use SSL encryption to encrypt the traffic. Okay. As I said, we're only going to cover the semi-honest case. In the malicious case, Then if the adversaries are malicious but are not allowed to abort, meaning to stop the computation, then they can have security against any number of corrupt parties, of malicious parties. If they can also abort, we can only have security against a minority of corrupt parties. These issues are covered by the GMW protocol, but we won't cover them. Okay. Now, how will the protocol go? So the first step will be for each party to share its input value among all other parties. So each party will get a share, and actually the sum of this share modulo 2 will be equal to original value. So if I have a certain input value, I'm going to share it among all other parties. So if all of them, including me, sum their shares together modulo 2, meaning if all of us XOR our values, we'll get the value that is shared. Then after we do this sharing, then for every gate we start from a setting where the input wires to that gate are shared. The values going into that gate are shared between the parties. And we should somehow, the parties in the computation should somehow compute a sharing of the output wire of that gate. Share the value going on the output wire of that gate. If we can show how to do that for every gate, we only have two gates, addition and multiplication, then the parties could do this for each gate, say in the first level of the wire, then of the circuit, then go on until they get to the end of the circuit. Okay? And once we get to the end of the circuit, we can just publish the output. So suppose we know that wire number 1000 is the output of a certain party, and each one of the other parties have a share of the value on that wire. Each party could send that share to that party, and he'll add the shares modulo 2 and learn the output bit on that wire. Okay, so the first step is sharing the input bits. So it's very simple. Basically, I have an input bit. I want all parties to have shares so that the exclusive of these shares will be equal to the input bit. So what they do is, so party I has input bit xi. So for every other j different than I, party I chooses a random bit, rij, and it sends that bit to party j. Then it sets its own share to be the exclusive OR between his original input value, and the sum of all the shares, sum modulo 2 of all shares, sent to the other parties. Okay, so this is what it does in that line. And now we can see that if we sum all the shares, compute the exclusive OR modulo 2, we get the original value. Because basically the sum of the pi, its component in that sum cancels with all the values it sent to the other parties, and what we get in the end is xi. So this is how sharing is done. After we do this sharing, then every party pj now has n shares, one for each input of each of the n parties. Okay? So that's how we start the computation. So for each input wire, suppose we have n input wires, each party have a share of that input wire, and they want to compute shares of the output of the gates. So we scan the circuit and we go wire by wire, and each gate, so the output wire C is a function of input wires A and B, and PI has shares of AI and BI of the input wires A and B, and it needs to get a share of the output wire C. We'll call that share CI. So the simplest case is that of addition gates, addition modulo 2, which is exclusive OR. So here to compute the share, PI simply XORs the two shares it has to the input wires. It computes the sum modulo 2. Okay? So no interaction is needed here for each addition wire, each addition gate. Each party just sums the two shares it has for the two input wires. And why does this work? So this gate computes addition modulo 2, so C equals A times D modulo 2. A is the sum of the shares, A1 up to AN. B is the sum of its shares, B1 up to Bn. So we have this share, and then we just reorder the elements and put the parentheses over each pair. We get that the output is equal to A1 plus B1 plus A2 plus B2 up to AN plus Bn, all modulo 2. But A1 plus B1 is the share that P1 have set for his output from that gate. And A2 plus B2 is the share that P2 has set for his output from that gate, and so on. So essentially, if each of them computes its share this way, they get shares of the output wire. So that's very nice. They only, each of them just work independently, doesn't have to communicate with each other. That's very simple and very efficient. That's computer source. Now, multiplication gates are more complicated. So what happens in a multiplication gate? So C is equal to the end, essentially to the multiplication modulo 2 of A and B. A is the sum of the shares A1 up to AN. B is the sum of B1 up to Bn. So if we open the parenthesis, we get that C is equal to the sum of AI Bi, for I going from 1 to n, plus the sum of AI Bj for every pair I and j that are different than each other. Okay? So we can just reorder them, and we see that it's the sum of AI Bi, plus for any I and j different than each other, we put in the sum AI times Bj plus Aj times Bi. Okay, and somehow they should do a sharing of C. So Pi will obtain a share of all the items in the sum in which Pi's shares contribute somehow. So Pi will obtain a share, of course, of Ai times Bi, but also of all elements in the sum in which Pi's values Ai and Bi contribute. So all elements in the sum of Ai times Bj or Aj times Bi, where I is one of the indices. Okay? Now, computing of share of AI times Bi is very easy. Pi knows Ai and Bi, he just multiplies them and he has the share. That's very easy. The tricky part is computing the sharing of Ai times Bj and Aj times Bi. And for this, Pi has to run a protocol with Pj. Okay? So Pj will run the following protocol for that. Okay, so the protocol as input, Pi has shares Ai and Bi, and Pj has inputs Aj and Bj. And the output of Pj should be some random Sij. And the output of Pi will be Ai times Bj plus Aj times Bi plus Sij. And we see that if we sum up these two values together, the S values cancel each other, we get what we need. We get basically two shares that sum up to Ai times Bj, Aj times Bi. Okay, so how should the protocol work? It basically works using Oblivious transfer. So Pj, his output should be a random S. So he chooses a random value Sij. It's modulo 2, so it's a random bit. And then it tells himself something like that. We should compute, Pi should receive this output. Pj knows the blue values. He knows his shares, Aj and Bj, and he knows the value Sij which he just computed. Okay? Now he knows the blue values, and he knows that Pi, has the red values, and each value is a bit. So there are two red values, so there are a total of 4 options for Pi values. Ai could be either 0 or 1, and Bi could be either 0 or 1. So what Pj tells himself says, okay, I don't know what Pi's input is, but I know all the blue values, and I know that if Pi's input is, say, 0, 0, I can use this equation and compute what his output would be. And if his input is 0, 1, I could use this equation again and compute his output, and so on. So Pj goes over the 4 possible options for Pi's input and compute what Pi's share would be, just by assigning these options to the red variables and computing what the value of this expression would be. Okay? So basically what Pj gets here is 4 values, and then Pj and Pi run an Oblivious transfer. So it's going to be a 1 out of 4 Oblivious transfer, meaning that Pj offers Pi to learn 1 out of 4 values, and Pi can choose to learn one of them. So I'll cover 1 out of 4 Oblivious transfer in a minute, but just to see what they're doing here. So basically, PJ doesn't know what PI's input is, but he knows, what the output will be for each of the 4 options for PI's input. He prepared these 4 outputs as a input to Oblivious transfer protocol. PI is the receiver in that Oblivious transfer protocol, and he chooses as his input a value which is 0 if his 2 inputs are 0, 1 if his inputs are 0, 1, 2 if his inputs are 1, 0, and 3 if his inputs are 1 and 1. So PI will receive as an output from the Oblivious transfer the exact value of this red and blue expression corresponding to PI's input. Okay. So after they do this 1 out of 4 Oblivious transfer, they both have these outputs we defined for the protocol. PJ has some random output Sij that he chose, and PI has a value that if we sum it with PJ's output, we get AI times BJ plus AJ times BI. Now I mentioned here 1 out of 4 Oblivious transfer. Before we only talked about 1 out of 2 Oblivious transfer, but you can actually implement 1 out of 4 Oblivious transfer using 1 out of 2 Oblivious transfers. I mean, you can think of it, say, as a cube, a cube of size 2 times 2, where you can choose to learn one of the rows and one of the columns, and only if he learns a row and a column of a certain entry, he learns the what's in the intersection. There are different ways of implementing them. It's very efficient. Okay, so you can do this 1 out of 4 Oblivious transfer using 1 out of 2 Oblivious transfers. So going back, so as I said, for each multiplication gate, each pair of parties should run this protocol. Okay, so if we have n parties, we have n choose 2 pairs of parties, and they're all going to run this protocol for each multiplication gate. Okay, doing Oblivious transfer. Now, what about output bits? So the protocol is going to compute shares for each output wire. For each wire of the circuit. In particular, at the end, it's going to compute shares for the output wires. And then if a certain output wire belongs to a certain party who should learn the output on that wire, then all parties are going to send their shares of that wire to that party, and he can just sum the shares and learn its output. Okay? So if we assume the parties are semi-honest, they just send him the shares, and that's it. So security, but before security, let's describe what's happening here in terms of efficiency. So the sharing of inputs is very efficient. You just send shares to each other party. Addition gates are very efficient. Multiplication gates require each pair of parties to run Oblivious transfer. That's the hard part. That's the complicated part of the protocol. Okay. Now, what about security? So we want to prove security against semi-honest adversaries, okay? And the definition Yehuda mentioned earlier says that to prove security, we should show that giving the input and output, we can generate the adversary's view in the protocol execution. So basically, the adversary doesn't learn anything in the execution that he couldn't learn from just seeing his input and output. So here we should show how, an adversary we can see, can simulate everything he sees in the protocol just from learning his input and output. Now, the worst case here is an adversary that controls all parties except for one and tries to attack that party. So suppose an adversary that controls the set J of all parties that includes all parties except for PI. So what is the simulator given? He's giving the input and output of all of the parties in the set J. So he's giving the input and output of all parties except for PI, and it should simulate the view in the protocol. So how would that work? So what about input wires? So what happens in input wires? So the simulator, for each party PJ that the simulator controls should send a message, a sharing of its input wire to the party PI that they want to attack. Now in the simulation, we're going to send a random share, random bit from Pj to Pi, but this is exactly what happens in the real execution. The real execution, also the parties, when they share the inputs, they're sending random bits. What about the shares that the parties J receive from Pi? In the actual execution, Pi sends each of the other parties random values. Therefore, it's easy to simulate this in the simulated execution, because the simulation will also send random values, random shares from Pi to each of the other parties, and they'll have the same distribution. This will have the same distribution as the one in the original protocol. What about addition gates? Addition gates, we don't have to care about them. There are no messages sent for addition gates. Everything is done internally. What about multiplication gates? So to share multiplication gate, for every party J whose index is smaller than I, which therefore runs as a receiver in the Oblivious transfer, okay, that we do for multiplication gate, the simulation will send that party a random bit to be his output in that Oblivious transfer. And for every party J whose index is greater than I, therefore when they evaluates gates together with Pi, this Pj runs as the sender in Oblivious transfer. Then the simulation will choose a random bit Sij and define the 4 inputs that party J gives to the Oblivious transfer to be the values that the protocol tells that party to input to the Oblivious transfer if it has this value Sij. What about output wires? So each party Pj, if it has an output, it's going to receive some message from Pi for evaluating that output. So the simulation will just send to that party a message, which is the XOR of the actual output that should be on that wire, Yj, and the shares that the parties in Pj have. And this share will have the same distribution as in the real protocol, because in the real protocol, what party Pj receives is random shares that XOR up to Yj, and this is also the distribution we have here. So this, the security proof basically shows that the messages that I described in the previous protocol have the same distribution as in the actual run. And I think I kind of covered this when I described the previous protocol. So the random shares, we simulate them with random bits that we send, but the random shares themselves are random bits, so they have the same distribution. Okay? In the Oblivious transfer, when Pj is the receiver, it receives in the actual run a random bit. In the simulation, we also receive the random bit. When Pj is the sender, then in the simulation, we chose a random bit Sij, right here in this line, and define the inputs to the Oblivious transfer as in the protocol. And this is exactly what Pj is doing in the real run of the protocol, so distribution will be the same. And for output wires, we also have the same distribution. So this protocol, the simulation has the same distribution of messages for the adversary Pj as in the real protocol. Therefore, the adversary doesn't learn here anything that it couldn't learn in the real execution. What about performance? So the parties must run an Oblivious transfer for every multiplication gate. Moreover, each pair of parties, so about n squared over 2 pairs of parties, have to do Oblivious transfer for every multiplication gate. Now, the implementation of Oblivious transfer that we saw in the morning used public key operations, so this is quite a lot. So if we compare this to Yau's protocol, so in Yau's protocol, and also in Yau's protocol, the parties did some symmetric key encryption like AES for each gate. Okay? Here they have to do Oblivious transfer, which is based on public key encryption for every gate. Now, you all know that symmetric key encryption is much more efficient than public key encryption. We can do millions or much more than millions of AES operations per second And today, AES is implemented in hardware as the AES-NI instruction in Intel chips, okay? Whereas if you want to do public key operations with exponentiations, we can do, say, 1,000 of these per second, okay? Give or take, something. So symmetric key operations are faster by, let's say, 3 orders of magnitude than public key operations. And here we need public key operations and not symmetric key operations per gate. So that's not that good. However, in a few minutes, I'll show you how to implement oblivious transfer using symmetric key operations. So the overhead here is going to be much better. Once we are able to implement oblivious transfer with symmetric key operations, it's going to be much more efficient. Another issue here, which is harder to fix, is that in this protocol, the parties need to do an interactive protocol between each pair for every multiplication gate. Basically, they have to exchange they have to exchange messages. Now, Yao's protocol used something between 2 and 4 communication rounds. And BMR protocol also had a constant number of communication rounds. In this protocol, you need to do a communication for every multiplication gates. If we have some multiplication gates in the same level, we can evaluate all of them in parallel, okay? But if the output of one multiplication gate is an input to another multiplication gate, we have to evaluate the first one before we can evaluate the second one. So the number of communication rounds we have in this protocol is going to be linear in the depth of the circuit, which I denote by D here, where D is the depth of the circuit where we only count multiplication gates. Okay? So for addition gates, we don't need to do any interaction. But unfortunately, for every multiplication gate, we need to do an interaction, and the number of rounds is going to be linear in the depth of the circuit. And that's actually I would say, the bottleneck of this protocol, the number of communication rounds. Now let's move to oblivious transfer extension. So we mentioned oblivious transfer a few times. So it's a two-party protocol where there's a sender, say P1, that has 2 inputs, say X0 and X1, a receiver that has an input bit S, and at the end of the protocol, the receiver should learn XS and nothing more. And the sender should learn nothing. We'll also discuss another variant, which we call random OT, where here the sender has 2 inputs, X0 and X1, and the receiver cannot choose his input. So basically, the protocol chooses a random bit S, and the receiver learns S and X of S, but he cannot choose what input to learn. Okay? But I'll show in a minute that random OT, you can implement oblivious OT. You can implement regular oblivious transfer, regular OT using random OT. And sometimes random OT used to define other variants, but we'll use this notation for this protocol. Now, how efficient is oblivious transfer? So oblivious transfer is quite efficient, but it requires some exponentiations per transfer. And we can only do, say, I'm inventing a number, but it's about the right number, say 1,000 exponentiations per second, okay? And if you want to do thousands or millions of oblivious transfers, this becomes quite inefficient, okay? And if we run the GMW protocol, we have to do oblivious transfers per gate, so then it becomes a real bottleneck. Now, we would like to implement oblivious transfer using symmetric key crypto alone, like AES, but unfortunately in 89, Impagliazzo and Woody showed that there's no black box construction of oblivious transfers from one-way functions. What does it mean? So from one-way functions, you can construct all symmetric key crypto, okay? So one-way function is the word of symmetric key crypto, okay? And black box constructions are constructions where you say, let me have any one-way function, and I'll show you how to construct oblivious transfer from it. The black box in the sense that they're not interested to see what's inside the one-way function, not in the particular implementation of that one-way function, just use it as a black box. And what Pagliaccio and Woody showed was you cannot construct oblivious transfer from one-way functions if you are in a black box manner. Okay, it's simply impossible. And unfortunately, most, if not all, of the constructions we know of cryptographic primitives are black box. So basically, they say, there's no way to construct oblivious transfer if we don't go with the particular implementation of the one-way functions, and there are no constructions like that. So basically, it says to do oblivious transfer, you need public key crypto. Okay. So this is kind of sad news or disappointing news. It says, look, we need exponentiations to do oblivious transfer. That's quite disappointing. However, oblivious transfer extension somehow overcomes that. So if we go back to in Pagliaccio and Rudig, they said, what they said was, you need exponentiations to do oblivious transfer. But they didn't prove that you need to do one exponentiation per oblivious transfer. Okay? They proved that, you cannot do oblivious transfer using, symmetric key crypto alone, but they didn't show, and it might not be needed, to do, quote, public key operations per every oblivious transfer. So what oblivious transfer extension does, it says it does something like that. Let's use a small number of base oblivious transfers. So we do a small number of oblivious transfers where, unfortunately, we have to use public key crypto because we cannot use symmetric key crypto to do oblivious transfer. But once we have this base of a small number of oblivious transfers, we'll use cheap symmetric crypto to then generate many more oblivious transfers that we need. And the numbers are something like, let's generate something like 128 or 80 real oblivious transfers. With these 128 real oblivious transfers, now we can generate any polynomial number of oblivious transfers using symmetric key crypto alone. So we can use millions, we can generate millions or billions of oblivious transfers using symmetric key crypto alone. So that's actually very nice. We'll have to do exponentiations, but only 128 of them times some constant. And then for the rest of the oblivious transfers, we'll be able to do symmetric key crypto alone. That's a very nice approach if we'll be able to implement it. In a sense, it seems like hybrid encryption. So if we want to encrypt messages with public key crypto, usually we don't encrypt the entire message with public key crypto. We use the public key crypto to encrypt some symmetric key, and this is quite inefficient. And then we use efficient symmetric encryption like AES to encrypt the rest of the message. So this is what we do here as well. We use oblivious transfers to start the things going, and then we use symmetric key operations to generate the rest of the oblivious transfers. So it's not clear that it's possible, but that's a nice goal to achieve. And I'll show you how it's been done, how it was done. So the first construction was due to Beaver. And this is the construction, and the slide doesn't say a lot, so let me describe the slide for you. Okay? So it's a very nice construction. It's still theoretical, but it shows how to do this. So P1 is the sender in the oblivious transfer, and P2 is the receiver. P1 constructs the circuit. And okay, recall we're doing M oblivious transfers, say 1,000,000 oblivious transfers, and we're willing to pay with N, say 128 real oblivious transfers to do that. So P1 first sets his inputs to the 1,000,000 oblivious transfers that you want to do. So it sets his inputs for these 1,000,000 oblivious transfers. And then the circuit also has other wires for P2's inputs. And P2's input for that circuit is going to be a random seed, say 128 bits long. Okay? So this circuit, say, has like 2,000,000 wires, which are P1's inputs. So there are 1,000,000 oblivious transfers, and for each oblivious transfer, say that it has two inputs, for 0 and for 1. And another 128 wires for P2's inputs. Okay? Now, I'll describe what the circuit is going to do in a minute, but we call it when computing a circuit with Yau's protocol, we do an oblivious transfer for each input of the receiver of P2. So the number of oblivious transfers we have to compute to evaluate this circuit is one oblivious transfer for each input of P2, okay? So we'll only have to do 128 oblivious transfers to compute this circuit. Okay? So I'll tell what the circuit is doing in a minute, but the number of oblivious transfers we need to compute is this circuit is only n, or 128 if n is 128. Now the circuit works as follows. P2's input is a seed, okay? The circuit is going to implement a pseudo-random generator that takes this seed and blow it up to a size m, so to a size, say, of 1,000,000 bits. Then the circuit is going to have, a million outputs, the outputs that P2 should have for each of the million OTs, and output number I is going to be the ith bit of the output of the generator, and the input of PI, which is associated with it. So suppose the first output bit of the generator is 0, so the first output of the circuit is going to be the bit 0, and R00, basically P1's input 0 for the first pair of inputs of P1, and so on. Okay? So this is a pretty complicated circuit. It has to implement a pseudo-random generator inside, okay? But to evaluate this circuit, we only do 128 oblivious transfers. P1 has to generate it. It's a very large circuit. P1 has to set his input wires, but he just sends to P2 his gobble values for these input wires. And then they do the oblivious transfers for P2's inputs, and they compute the output of the function. So this circuit computes 1,000,000 actually random OTs using only 128 OTs. Now, how big the circuit should be? So if we're thinking about a pseudo-random generator, suppose that's the AES function. So the AES function can generate 128-bit output using something like 33,000 gates. So it's about 300 gates per output bit. So this circuit is going to use at least 300 gates per output bit here. Okay? So it's not a small circuit, it's actually a pretty big one. Okay? It's probably not going to be more efficient than implementing the oblivious transfers from scratch, but at least it shows that you can implement these things using only a small number of oblivious transfers. So that was Beaver's extension, which was very nice, but it was more as a theorem, but no one thought that it could be this certainly cannot be implemented. It doesn't seem to be efficient. Something to note here, just a technical issue, is that the function computed in Beaver's construction is random OT, meaning that P2 is the receiver, but he cannot choose his input bit for each of the 1,000,000 oblivious transfers. He just chooses a seed, and the seed is expanded by the random number generator to be 1,000,000 bit long, and define his inputs for all the oblivious transfers. So basically P2 is the receiver, but his input bit S for any oblivious transfer, there are going to be different S's for each oblivious transfer, is randomly chosen. So for each oblivious transfer, the sender has a pair of inputs, say R0 and R1, and P2 learns a random bit RS, but he cannot control which bit it's going to compute, it's going to learn. And we would like to implement regular OT using random OT, and we can do it as follows. So in a regular OT, P1's input is X0, X1, and P2's input is some sigma that P2 wants to choose. However, the parties run a random OT where P1's input is R0, R1, and P2's input is a random S, which is chosen for P2. It cannot choose it by himself. And P2 receives S and RS. Now, to use this to implement the regular OT, P2 has to send to P1 the XOR between S, the bit, the index of the output he learned in the random OT, and sigma, the index that he wants to learn in the usual, in the regular OT. So this XO essentially is 0 if P2 was lucky and learned in the random OT the exact index it wants to learn in the regular OT. And T is 1 if P2 learned in the random OT, you know, the other value, not the one he wants to learn in the regular OT, but the value with the other index. So essentially what this T is going to tell us when you want to implement a regular OT from this random OT is whether P1 should reverse the order of its inputs or not. And I'll show you how to do that. So after P1 receives this bit T, what he sends to P2 is Y0, which is the encryption of X0 with the pad T, and Y1, which is the encryption of X1 with the pad minus T. And P2 can decrypt it. So let's see what happens here. So if T was 0, okay, this means that P2 learned RS, where RS is the pad, of course, S is sigma, is the value, is the index of the value that P2 wants to receive. Then what P1 sends to P2 is X0 encrypted with R0 and X1 encrypted with R1. But in that case, P2 learned the pad that corresponds to the item it wants to decrypt, and it's able to decrypt the item that it wants to decrypt from these two. However, suppose that P2 wanted to learn X0, and in the random OT it learned 1 and R1. In that case, T, the XO of 0 and sigma, is going to be 1. And in this case, P1 is going to send to P2 X0 encrypted with R1 and X1 encrypted with R0. Here again, P2 will be able to decrypt the item that it wants to decrypt. So the correctness here basically says what I said in the previous slide, showing that P2 can decrypt what it needs to decrypt here. And in terms of privacy, so what P1 sees in the protocol is just this random bit T, which tells him to reverse the order with which it encrypts its values or not. But this is just a random bit, so it reveals nothing. And also what P2 sees is one item encrypted with R0 and one item encrypted with R1. And he also gets to learn either R0 or R1. So obviously he can only decrypt one of the two items, not both of them. So this shows that this random OT that was computed in Beaver's protocol is sufficient to implement a regular OT. Now, Beaver's protocol is nice in showing the feasibility of doing oblivious transfers, many oblivious transfers, but just computing a small number of actual oblivious transfers, but it wasn't efficient. And then about 10 years ago came a very nice protocol by Ishai, Kilian, Isil, and Petrank, which showed an efficient way of extending OT. So in that protocol, you start with something like N, which is something like 128 OTs, and then you can implement M OTs, where M is any polynomial, let's say 1,000,000, very efficiently, with just a few encryptions per OT. So what the part is, so from now on, instead of N, I'm going to say 128, and instead of M, I'm going to say 1,000,000, because it's when I say N and M, it's hard to distinguish what I want to say, and 128 and 1,000,000, they're different. So the sender has 1,000,000 pairs input for the OTs, and the receiver has 1,000,000 choices, one for each OT. And we want to implement this using only 128 OTs. So the first phase is kind of strange. So the receiver samples 128 random strings, each one of them of length 1,000,000 bits. So it samples only 128 bits, but strings, but each one of them is 1,000,000 bits long. Now for each of these strings, it prepares a pair which contains either this string TI or Ti XORed with sigma. So sigma is the million choices of the receiver in the oblivious transfer. So it prepares one of these, it prepares a pair containing these two options, and it plays the sender in oblivious transfer. Now, the actual sender in the real oblivious transfers chooses a random string S of n bits, 128 bits, and uses it as a receiver in these oblivious transfers. So the thing that is very confusing here, okay? So we have the oblivious transfers that we want to implement. There we have a sender and a receiver. In the base OTs, we reverse the roles between themselves, between these two, okay? So in the base OTs, the party who should be the sender in the real oblivious transfers is going to be the receiver, and the party who's going to be the receiver in the real oblivious transfer is going to be the sender, okay? So let me go over this again. So the receiver in the real oblivious transfers is now the sender. He prepares 128 pairs. Each pair contains this million-bit long random string Ti, and the string which is the XOR of that Ti with sigma, the choices of the receiver in the oblivious transfer. And the receiver chooses to learn, the sender chooses to learn one of these two strings at random. Okay? And we call the sender's choice in the ith oblivious transfer Ti. So this is a graphic description. So in the base OT, the receiver, who's here he's the sender, prepares two strings. Each one of them is a million bits long. One is Ti, which is random. The other one is Ti XORed with sigma. And the sender chooses to learn one of them. So let's denote his output here as Qi. Qi is equal to Ti if he chose Si equals 0. He chose to learn the 0 option. And Qi is Ti XOR sigma if he chose to learn the 1 option, if Si is 1. And sigma, just to recall, is the receiver's choices in the real oblivious transfers. So they do 128 of these. So they only do 128 oblivious transfers, but of really, really long strings. At the end of that, the sender in the real oblivious transfers, who's now the receiver, received 128 strings. These are the columns. And each column is a million bit long. Q1, Qn, Q2 up to Qn. And Qi is either Ti or Ti XOR sigma. And the receiver in the real oblivious transfers knows the Ti columns which he chose at random. And he also knows sigma. Now let's look at the first row. The first row, so there are 128 columns. It has 128 bits. So if the receiver's choice in the first oblivious transfer, the real oblivious transfer, was 0, meaning that the first bit of sigma, sigma 1, is 0, then for each one of these, what we get here is Ti. It's either Ti or Ti XOR sigma, but sigma is 0. So in each one of the columns, what we have in the first row is 0. So we have 0, 0, 0. We have Ti. So if sigma 1 was 0, the first row of the sender is equal to the first row of the receiver. Okay. Now what happens if sigma 1 is 1? So if Si was, so in each column, if Si was 0, we get an equality. Ti, well, what we get here is exactly what we got here. We don't XOR it with anything. However, if Si was 1, what we get here is Ti XOR sigma, which is Ti XOR 1. Okay, and here, this is actually the important thing to note here, is that if sigma 1 was 1, if the receiver's choice in the first oblivious transfer was 1, then the first row of the sender is equal to the first row of the receiver XOR S. S is the vector of 128 choices that the server made in the Oblivious transfer is essentially a string of length 128 bits, which only the server knows here, the sender knows here. Okay? So what we get here is that if the receiver's choice here was 0, this row is equal to the row that the receiver had. And if the receiver's choice was 1, this row is equal to that row XOR with S, which is a string that only the server knows. And for the second row, we get exactly the same thing, and the same thing happens for each of the rows. So, okay, we did the n-oblivious transfers. We transferred the matrix. We looked at each of the rows. We just looked at the first row, the second row. And denote the ith row as Qi. This is the row of the sender on the left side, and Ti is the row of the receiver. What we got is that if the choice of the receiver is 0, then Ti is equal to Qi. The rows are equal. But if the choice of the receiver was 1, then Ti is equal to Qi XOR S, where S is a string that is only known to the server. Okay? And now the nice part, to do the ith transfer, what the sender is doing, he's encrypting his 0 bit in the ith transfer using some hash function of Qi, and he's encrypting his 1 input to the ith transfer with some hash function of Qi XOR S. Okay? S is this string that only the sender knows. And the receiver can decrypt. Why is this true? So, look, if the receiver wanted to learn the 0 input, in that case, sigma I is 0. In that case, what the receiver knows, Ti is equal to Qi, and indeed the 0 input was encrypted with the hash of Qi. Okay? So the receiver is able to decrypt it. If the receiver wanted to learn the 1 output, then in that case, Ti, the row that the receiver has, is Qi XORed with S. And indeed, in this case, the 1 input is encrypted with the hash of Qi XORed with S. So the receiver is able to decrypt it. Okay? Now, remember that S is a value which is only known to the server. Okay? So if the receiver knows Qi, it doesn't know anything about Qi XOR S, and vice versa. So this seems to hint that he'll be able to decrypt just one of these two entries and not both of them. So what about security here? So for corrupt sender, the sender is the receiver in the initial 128 oblivious transfers. He either learned a random column Ti or a random column Ti XORed with the receiver's choices. In any case, he learns a random column. Okay, what he sees is random, so he learns nothing from it. What about the corrupt receiver? So the sender's two values, one of them is masked with a hash of Qi, and the other with a hash of Qi XORed with S, where S is unknown to the receiver. Now, the receiver has one of these two values, but not both. Now, if we model this hash function as a random oracle, and I haven't mentioned what that is, then if you don't know S, you can easily prove that the receiver can only decrypt one of these two options. Otherwise, if we assume something which we call the correlation robustness assumption, which basically says that receiving if we know a set of values R, then if we don't know S, then this set of values, no. If we don't know S and we choose these values R at random, this set of values, which include the R values and the hashes of R, the R's XORs with S, is pseudo-random. So using that assumption, we can prove this oblivious transfer to be secure against the corrupt receiver. Now, how efficient is this thing? So it's nice in the sense that they only have to do 128 oblivious transfers, which each one of them might cost a few exponentiations, that's about it. And then they could do millions and millions of Oblivious transfers using that just hash function evaluations. So it's very, very efficient. It's really nice. So 2 years ago, so Gilad Asharev and Yehuda Linde from Bar-Ilan and Thomas Schneider and Michael Zoner from TU Darmstadt actually looked at implementing this, and they saw that things were actually quite, a bit more complicated, but they managed to sorting out, and we actually obtained a very efficient implementation of this OT extension. So, one nice thing that they discovered was that something which was a bottleneck of the computation was computing matrix transpose. Okay, just if we go back, so we had this matrix here, and the sender learned, columns of this matrix. Okay, and then to do the encryption, he had to choose either the first row, and the second row, and so on. Okay. But if you learn columns, you probably store them as columns, and then you had to take, say, the first bit in each of the columns, then the second bit, and so on. And this was quite inefficient because you had to go to many variables and choose, say, bit number 17 in each of these variables and concatenate them together. And this took, a lot of time. So one option was to take the matrix which was stored, say, as columns and do a transpose of that matrix. But this matrix contains a few million or 128 billion entries, say. So computing a transpose of that matrix doesn't fit in the cache or in main memory. Okay, so it's very time consuming. So by identifying these issues and using cache-aware algorithms, they were able to make these computations very efficient and achieve a throughput of a few million Oblivious transfer per second, or at least 1 million Oblivious transfer per second on a single core back then 2 years ago. So this technology is very efficient nowadays. Okay. Now, what I described here was a protocol secure against semi-honest adversaries. Doing this with security against malicious adversaries is much more complicated. I think that Claudio is going to talk about TinyOT on Tuesday. And on the last day, Gilad Asharev is going to talk about a new protocol which does OT extension secure against malicious adversaries. And that's it for this hour.